Would you like to see the most boring graph in the world? Here it is. Well, it doesn't look much different from this graph. This shows the price of oil over 20 years. It seems strange that people are so obsessed with it, constantly watching it. The thing is, they didn't pay much attention to it before. This graph shows the price from the 1950s to the 1970s. It was a good, stable time, but the next 30 years were quite tumultuous. Nowadays, there is a volatile mess that would make even Bitcoin envious. What the heck? In this episode, you will learn why Richard Nixon wanted to invade Saudi Arabia, what the oil needle is, and who the Seven Sisters are.
Oil is scarce in many areas today. The cause of that scarcity is not a lack of reserves or a lack of production.
Our story begins with a name that seems straight out of a fantasy world, the Seven Sisters. But our sisters look like this. Now we will uncover the secrets of the one in the middle, British Petroleum, known at the time as the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. In fact, it was more Iranian than British. 2/3 of the oil production took place there, and the company's history began with the discovery of oil in southwestern Persia. The collaboration lasted for over 40 years, but in 1951 the Iranian government, unable to reach an agreement with the British over profit sharing, decided to nationalize the oil industry. In simple terms, they took the British assets and transferred them to the National Iranian Oil Company, established 3 years prior. Incidentally, March the 20th is still celebrated as a national holiday. While preparing for this episode, I was amazed by this fact and asked my Iranian friend if this event truly became a national holiday. It turned out to be true. In 1951, the British were also taken aback. Besides expressing strong concern, they began actions quite familiar to us today. On August the 22nd, the British cabinet imposed a series of economic sanctions on Iran. They prohibited the export of key British commodities, including sugar and steel, to Iran, directed the withdrawal of all British personnel from Iranian oil fields, and of all but a hard core of about 300 administrators from Abadan, and blocked Iran's access to its hard currency accounts in British banks. Apart from sanctions and recalling specialists, Great Britain decided to show some real politics. When the Italian tanker Rosemary tried to leave an Iranian port, it was intercepted by the British Royal Navy and escorted to where it needed to go. This news changed everything. Britain's seizure of the Rosemary was a devastating blow to Mossadegh and his government. No oil company would now do business with Iran. So, everything seemed great. Iranian oil now belonged entirely to the state rather than the gentlemen of the foggy Albion. The only problem was there was no one to sell it to, and the skilled personnel needed for its extraction and processing had left, and as a result, the country's main source of income was gone. Iran had earned $45 million from oil exports in 1950, more than 70% of its total export earnings. That sum dropped by half in 1951 and then to almost zero in 1952. And when there's significant unrest in the world, the US State Department can't stand idly by. In this situation, they did what they do best. No, I said what they do best. A coup d'etat. In 1953, the CIA and British intelligence conducted Operation Ajax, also known as the Iranian coup d'etat, overthrowing the inconvenient Prime Minister of Iran within 3 days. This minor triumph of American democracy allowed the US to secure a stake in the Iranian oil business. As a result, on April the 10th, 1954, an agreement was reached, returning 40% of Iran's oil assets to the future British Petroleum. Another 40% was split among 5 American corporations, 14% went to the British Shell, and the remaining 6% was granted to the French Total as a little bonus. Enrico Mattei, the head of the Italian company ENI, was also eager to participate in the distribution, but he was told, "Affanculo! Affanculo!" Enraged, Enrico coined the term Seven Sisters to describe the oil cartel. He must have been a very diplomatic person because the term sounds relatively benign. Well, during this period of blockade and coups, the price must have skyrocketed, right? Yeah, I thought so too. But from 1952 to 1954, the price only rose by a meager 13%. From today's perspective, such growth, given such circumstances, seems quite modest. This is because the Seven Sisters, even before they received their unoffensive nickname, were already a well-organized cartel, controlling 3/4 of the world's oil production during their prime years. By agreeing, they kept prices comfortable for everyone, regardless of shocks. Even if you don't know a thing about monopolistic pricing, it can be understood intuitively. A cartel wants to make as much money as possible and can drive prices sky high. But if they overdo it, customers will gradually switch to other energy sources, and the short-term gains will lead to a diminished market in the long term. Understanding this, the Seven Sisters maintained a price that maximized not the profit percentage, but its absolute total. If the price was set too high, profitability might increase, but the number of buyers would gradually decrease along with the total revenue. We'll encounter an example of this a bit further on, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. Up next is a cartel well known in our time, OPEC.
Oil is scarce in many areas today. The cause of that scarcity is not a lack of reserves or a lack of production.
The gentleman's agreement that had been in place for decades with Middle Eastern countries followed a simple formula, 50-50. In other words, 50% of the profits stayed in the producing company, while 50% went to the multinational corporation. On the surface, this sounds fair, but there's an important nuance. Who set the prices? As you might guess, that right remained with British Petroleum, Shell, and others. This meant that Middle Eastern countries did not control the price of the resource beneath their own feet. In the early 20th century, such an agreement was due to technological underdevelopment, limited finances, and overall dependence on Western countries. However, by mid-century, the Middle Eastern giant began to rise, and as you remember from the previous chapter, ideas about regaining control began to take root. The situation escalated in 1955 when a powerful and familiar to you player in red entered the European and Asian markets, the Soviet Union. Crude oil from the former Soviet Union also began to make its way into the market. The discovery and development of large fields in the Soviet bloc led to a rapid growth in Russian oil exports from less than 100,000 BD in 1956 to nearly 700,000 BD in 1961. The additional supply from the communist Soviet Union forced the well-known Seven Sisters to lower their prices on the capitalist market. The Seven Sisters decided on 2 successive cuts in their posted prices, one in 1959 and the other in 1960, thus lowering the taxes they paid to their host governments. This decision proved to be a fateful step. This decision displeased the producers. Against the Western sisters, 5 non-Western sisters entered the ring in the form of Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Venezuela. In September 1960, they established the well-known OPEC organization with a single idea: to control oil prices, not by directly setting selling prices, but indirectly through supply control. It sounds complicated, but they simply divided production quotas among themselves and stopped production once those quotas were met. Less supply on the market meant higher prices. In the previous chapter, only Iran stood against the cartel sellers, but now a whole cartel of producers had entered the ring. Fighting everyone was not an option. The business project called OPEC was so attractive that within the first 10 years of its existence, it doubled the number of participants. Qatar, Libya, the UAE, Algeria, and Indonesia joined. Of the 10 member states, 7 were Arab petrostates that greatly disliked the United States. But there was one country they disliked even more: Israel.
This is NBC Nightly News, Wednesday, October 17th.
Good evening. The Middle East war produced developments all over the world today. The oil-producing countries of the Arab world decided to use their oil as a political weapon.
On October 6, 1973, Egyptian forces in the south and Syrian tank battalions in the north crossed the Israeli border. The former aimed to capture the Sinai Peninsula, while the latter targeted the Golan Heights. Without delving into the conflict details, suffice it to say that it ended 19 days later as usual. Israel once again expanded its territory as it had in the previous 2 instances. The conflict became known as the Yom Kippur War. Although Egypt and Syria were not OPEC members, other Arab countries supported their actions in word and deed. When this didn't help, on October 17th, an unprecedented decision was made. The Arab members of OPEC imposed an embargo on oil supplies to Western countries that supported Israel. And on top of that, they reduced production. Of course, this had no impact on the war's outcome, but it did bring great satisfaction from the opportunity to harm the Americans. They were hit pretty hard. Oil prices soared 6.5 times. For Western buyers, this was a huge shock. The embargo revealed how dependent the West was on black gold, and this was unacceptable to the United States. The declassified British memorandum said the United States considered launching airborne troops to seize oil fields in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Abu Dhabi, but only as a last resort. Fortunately, an invasion was avoided and negotiations were successful. The embargo was lifted in just 5 months. But prices didn't return to previous levels. On the contrary, they were further inflated by the Iranian Revolution in 1979, after which Iran's oil production dropped 4-fold. The world experienced another 3-fold price surge. In total, prices rose 20-fold over 10 years.
Oil is scarce in many areas today. The cause of that scarcity is not a lack of reserves or a lack of production.
Imagine this scenario. You work and every year your salary increases. Sometimes it triples, sometimes it doubles. It's a wonderful, prosperous time, almost like a fantasy. But that's exactly how things were going for oil exporters, until suddenly the free ride came to an end after 1980. Prices started to decline. Saudi Arabia, the world's leading exporter, having already enjoyed the fruits of monopoly tools, tried to stop the price decline by drastically reducing production. Over 5 years, the Saudis reduced production by 2.5 times, hoping to return to the 1970s. But nobody intended to return to the 70s. Non-OPEC countries, also learning from the past, understood the move the Saudis were trying to pull. Like sharks, they decided to seize the juicy, freeing up market share. As a result, OPEC's share of oil production fell from 50% to 27%. At the same time, major oil importers, shocked by the sky-high prices, began leveling up their conservation and diversification talent trees. For example, by the mid-1980s, the United States was able to reduce its import of black gold from 46% to 28% and found new suppliers in Mexico, Nigeria, and Norway. And apparently, because the world realized that it didn't rely solely on OPEC, prices in the 1980s started to decline, despite the fact that global oil production remained unchanged. By the way, this graph is sometimes cited as the main reason for the collapse of the Soviet Union. The date of the USSR's collapse is well known. It's not the Beloveds Accords, it's not the August events, it's September the 13th, 1985. The day when Saudi Arabia's oil minister Yamani announced that Saudi Arabia would stop restraining oil production and start regaining its market share. In the next 6 months, Saudi Arabia's oil production increased 3.5 times and prices plummeted. You can look at it monthly. It fell 6.1 times. It seems that the former finance minister slightly exaggerated, and we could make a separate video around this thesis, especially since Reagan's son had quite a bit to say about it. But if you're interested in this topic for a video, let us know in the comments so we know you'd find it interesting.
Oil is scarce in many areas today. The cause of that scarcity is not a lack of reserves or a lack of production.
Until now, we've only looked at one part of the price formation process: supply. But what about demand? Here's what oil consumption looked like in 1985. Who do you think was this top consumer, devouring more black gold than anyone else? That's right, the USA. But in the following years, the USA gained a serious competitor, which broke away from the rest and increased its appetite, almost matching America. You've probably guessed that this competitor was China. In 1994, China surpassed Germany to become the second largest oil consumer in the world. From one of our previous videos, you may remember that since the early 1980s, China embraced openness, attracted investments, transitioned to market socialism, and ensured double-digit GDP growth for the next 40 years. Our Chinese tiger needed fuel for its economic miracle. As a result, market players began to consider the demand from China alongside supply constraints due to Middle Eastern conflicts or OPEC production cuts. You might recall this from our previous video. China's role in resource consumption is so large that as soon as there is positive news about industrial production, global oil prices react immediately. As a result, over 10 years, the price of black gold soared by 7.5 times. Unlike the panic-driven spikes of the 1970s, this growth was purely market-driven and justified. Well, justified to an extent. China's consumption actually only doubled and global consumption increased by about 20%. So the price reaction was once again disproportionate to its scale, though understandable from a market perspective. But we're used to this by now, aren't we? Amid rising consumption in China and consequently rising oil prices, the income of oil exporters increased, including Russia, China's neighbor. Throughout this period, there was much discussion about the role of oil revenues in the country and the risks of getting hooked on the oil needle. Some argued that one needed to be cautious with black gold revenues. The presence of significant natural resources leads both political and business elites to focus their efforts on controlling natural rent instead of working on increasing labor productivity. When the elite is not interested in structural reforms, modernization, or economic diversification, the opportunity for necessary reforms is lost. Others claimed that oil revenues were a blessing that needed to be used wisely. We need to direct tens of billions of dollars, which already require investment opportunities today, and those oil revenues that we hope Russia will receive in the future into the aerospace complex, the nuclear industry, and other sectors where our country still holds leading positions globally, and into production and related research that creates new technologies. Then, by 2010, it is quite realistic to not only double GDP, but to do so on a new technological basis, returning Russia to the position of a leading scientific and technological power, one of the main players in the global high-tech market. It seems that both camps were talking about the same thing, just from different perspectives. Certainly, it is hard to deny the influence of oil revenues. However, there is a country in the world that fell into a genuine oil dependency. The phenomenon even has a diagnosis: Dutch disease. This is when oil strengthens the currency, local production becomes too expensive to export, and as a result it declines, hooking on the oil needle, as seen in this example. Here are queues for food and soldiers being rewarded with a scarce commodity: toilet paper. Those without it can use the national currency for the same purposes. It's cheaper. Welcome to Venezuela. Hugo Chavez took over a country where 80% of exports were fuel. By the end of his rule, he managed to make it even higher. The share in exports reached 98%. When oil prices started to fall, Venezuela plunged into a crisis of such magnitude that it was unimaginable, even during the Great Depression. And who's to blame for all this? Well, of course, America.
Oil is scarce in many areas today. The cause of that scarcity is not a lack of reserves or a lack of production.
In 2004, the price of oil surpassed its historical highs from the 1980s and continued to skyrocket, reaching a new record in 2012. While Venezuela was using its oil money to buy fish, America was buying a fishing rod. The United States actually ranks among the top 10 countries in the world for oil reserves, which also places it in the category of nations blessed by the gods. But there is a catch: more than half of these reserves are buried too deep beneath various layers of rock, or shale, making it difficult and, most importantly, expensive to extract. Horizontal drilling is required in this case. You can see the schematic difference in this picture. As long as oil prices remained relatively modest, no one bothered to extract this shale oil. However, the steady rise in prices in the 2000s made this technology economically viable, and the US began to drill actively.
Drill, baby, drill.
Let's return to the classic supply and demand model. In the previous chapter, we discussed how growing demand from China pushed prices upwards. Here we see a similar upward trend, but this time from the supply side, driven by the US. By the mid-2010s, American oil production almost equaled that of Saudi Arabia, and in that same year, oil prices dropped by half, dragging Venezuela into an abyss. Russia could have followed suit, since falling prices were accompanied by Western sanctions at the time. However, Russian financial authorities managed to bring the country back to a position of relative stability, demonstrating that rumors of the oil needle and Dutch disease were somewhat exaggerated. But this does not mean that there are no signs at all. When planning the budget in Russia, the price of oil remains one of the key indicators. I hope this quick and superficial excursion into the history of oil prices was engaging for you. We've seen how oil has led to coups, discussions about possible territorial takeovers, and restrictions on the supply of valuable resources in hopes of bending others to one's will. We've observed how increased demand due to the development of one country drives prices up, while the supply from another country, through the deployment of horizontal drilling, pulls them down. We've seen that the market's direction is often appropriate for the events, but the reaction is always excessively disproportionate to the actual scale. Oil remains the most important source of wealth and a tool for political leverage. The key question now is whether oil consumers can switch to alternative sources, and if so, how much this will affect oil producers. You know who to share this video with. We thank the members of our cartel and promise to continue delivering long-term informational profit. And I'm the researcher.